The air was heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid stench of gunpowder, as if the very atmosphere had been tainted by the carnage that unfolded before me. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the gruesome tableau that stretched out before me. Bodies were strewn about like discarded dolls, their limbs twisted into impossible angles, their faces contorted in agony. The ground was slick with blood, reflecting the flickering light of the emergency lamps overhead, creating a grotesque mirror image of the horror that had transpired. I could hear the wail of sirens in the distance, growing louder by the second, as the first responders raced towards the scene of the massacre. But for now, there was only silence. A silence that seemed to echo with the unspoken screams of the victims, their final cries of terror and pain etched into the very fabric of reality. My breath hitched in my throat as I took in the sight of a young woman, her face frozen in a rictus of fear, her hands pressed against a gaping wound in her chest. Blood oozed slowly from between her fingers, staining the front of her blouse crimson. I forced myself to look away, my gaze drifting to the bodies sprawled around her, their features obscured by shadows and darkness. But no matter where I looked, there was no escape from the carnage. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow darting across the floor, weaving in and out of the dying lights. I whirled around, my heart racing, my hands trembling with the effort to steady my weapon. But there was nothing there. Just the silence and the blood and the bodies. I forced myself to calm down, to focus on the task at hand. I had to find out what had happened here, and I had to make sure it never happened again. I started with the wounded, doing what I could to stabilize them until the medical teams arrived. As I worked, my mind raced, trying to piece together the events that had transpired. It was clear that this had been no ordinary attack. The precision with which the victims had been targeted, the speed with which they had been dispatched, it was as if the perpetrator had known exactly what they were doing, and exactly where to strike. I glanced over at the young woman with the wound in her chest. Despite my efforts, I knew that there was little hope for her. Her breathing was shallow, her skin deathly pale. I wanted to reach out and comfort her, to tell her that everything was going to be okay, but I knew better. There was no comfort to be found in this place, in this moment. As the sirens grew louder, signaling the imminent arrival of the first responders, I stepped back, my hands trembling once more. I didn't know what had caused this carnage, or who was responsible, but I knew one thing for certain. This was not the end. There would be more bloodshed, more victims. I had to find whoever was behind this, and I had to stop them, before they could strike again. I walked over to the nearest emergency phone and dialed the number for the precinct. As I waited for someone to pick up, I glanced around at the scene of devastation once more, my heart heavy with the weight of the responsibility that now rested on my shoulders. The bodies lay where they had fallen, their lives snuffed out in an instant. It was a crime scene, and I was the detective assigned to unravel the mystery. 911, what's your emergency? Came the voice over the phone, snapping me back to reality. I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves, and began to speak. I recited my badge number and then recounted what I had seen, the bodies strewn about the room, the young woman with the wound in her chest. I was just a rookie cop, this was my first week on the job, and I was terrified by what I had witnessed. The academy had not prepared me for this. I told them about the precision of the killer, the way they seemed to have known exactly where to strike. As I spoke, I could hear the shock and horror in my own voice, mirroring the emotions churning inside me. When I finally finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, a deep, authoritative voice spoke. Detective, I want you to know that everything you just said, it's going to be taken care of. We'll find whoever did this, and we'll bring them to justice. But in the meantime, you need to focus on the living. The victims who are still clinging to life. You're going to need to help them, and you're going to need to protect them. Do you understand? I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Yes, sir. I understand. I hung up the phone, my resolve strengthened. I would find the person responsible for this, no matter what it took. I would bring them to justice, and I would make sure that they could never hurt anyone again. Because in a world filled with darkness, it was up to those of us with the light to stand tall, and to fight back. Even when the odds were stacked against us. Even when the cost was high. Even when the future seemed hopeless. We had to keep fighting, because that was all we could do. That was our duty. That was our purpose. I made my way over to the first officer on the scene, a seasoned veteran with more than 20 years on the force, as backup arrived. "Detective," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the day's events. "You've been assigned to this one, huh?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He looked me in the eye, and I could see the understanding there. He knew what it was like to have a personal connection to a case like this, to have someone you love torn away from you. "I'm sorry, Detective," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "I know how it feels." I forced a smile, even though it hurt. "Thanks, partner. Let's go see what we can find." Together, we began to sift through the chaos, searching for any clues that might lead us to the person responsible for this carnage. As we moved through the room, my mind raced, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. I couldn't help but wonder if my sister had been in pain before she died. If she had suffered at the hands of this monster. The thought was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I found myself standing in front of a computer screen, staring at a grainy surveillance camera feed, leaving the officers and medical examiner to do their work. The footage showed a shadowy figure entering the room, moving quickly and efficiently among the tables. It was a professional killer, someone who had done this before. Someone who was skilled at taking lives without remorse. Someone who I would have to find, if I ever hoped to bring my sister's killer to justice. But something about the footage didn't add up. As the figure moved across the screen, the surveillance feed seemed to stutter and skip. It was as if the camera had lost its focus on the killer, as if he were somehow invisible to the naked eye. I called over one of the tech specialists, a young woman with hair tied back in a tight bun. "Take a look at this," I said, pointing to the screen. "What do you make of it?" She leaned in close, her eyes narrowing as she studied the footage. "It looks like a jamming device of some sort," she said finally. "Whoever did this must have brought something in with them that's blocking the signal. Probably something small and portable, like a cell phone or a walkie-talkie." She paused, her brow furrowing. "But it's not something I've seen before. It's pretty sophisticated." I nodded, my heart racing. A sophisticated jamming device could mean only one thing: we were dealing with a professional. Someone who knew what he was doing, and who had access to cutting-edge technology. The implication sent a shiver down my spine. "Thanks, Rachel," I said, standing up and walking away from the computer. "Let's keep digging. We'll find whoever did this, and we'll bring him to justice." But even as I said the words, I knew deep down that the task ahead of us was going to be far from easy. That the shadowy figure on the screen was just the beginning. That the real battle was about to begin. The medical examiner had finished processing the bodies, and the coroner had arrived to take them away. The room was slowly being restored to its original state, but the sense of loss and despair lingered in the air like a thick fog. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time, that our killer was one step ahead of us, and that my sister's death was only the beginning. As the sun began to rise, casting its first faint rays of light through the window, I finally called it a night. I sat down at my desk, rubbing my eyes wearily, and tried to make sense of everything that had happened. My thoughts kept returning to the grainy surveillance camera feed, and the mysterious figure who had managed to slip away into the night. I knew that I couldn't rest until I found them, until I brought them to justice. Because as long as they were out there, as long as they were free to commit their heinous crimes, no one was safe. Not even me. I looked over at Detective Santos, who was poring over a stack of files on her desk. She glanced up at me, her eyes weary and red-rimmed from the long night. "You want to take a break?" she asked. "Get some coffee, maybe grab some breakfast?" I nodded, forcing a tired smile. "Yeah," I said. "I think that's a good idea." As we made our way out of the interrogation room, the harsh fluorescent lights and sterile atmosphere of the police station giving way to the relative calm of the bullpen, the weight of what had happened began to lift from my shoulders, if only momentarily. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of chattering detectives going about their business provided a welcome distraction from the grisly scene that still haunted my thoughts. Over coffee and a quick bite to eat, Detective Santos and I tried to piece together what had happened. The more we talked, the more I realized that the killer had been incredibly thorough. Not only had he managed to evade the security cameras, but he had also left no trace evidence behind. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. As we sat there, lost in thought, my cell phone buzzed with an incoming text message. I glanced down at the screen, expecting it to be another well-wisher offering their condolences or a colleague wanting an update on the case. Instead, it was an anonymous message, simply reading, "You shouldn't have let her die." The chill that ran down my spine was instant and undeniable. The killer was still out there, watching us, waiting for their next move. Detective Santos noticed the look on my face and asked me what was wrong. I showed her the message, and she frowned, her expression grave. "This is getting creepy," she muttered. "We need to step up our game." She took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and then looked at me. "I think it's time we brought in some outside help." I nodded in agreement. We both knew that we were in over our heads, and that we needed someone with more experience and resources to help us catch this killer. But as I dialed the number of the FBI hotline, my heart raced with a mixture of hope and fear. Because with every step we took closer to finding the person responsible for my sister's death, we were also moving further into the dangerous world they inhabited. A world where anything could happen, and no one was safe. As the FBI agent on the other end of the line listened to our report, his expression grew more serious by the second. "This is certainly a chilling development," he said, his voice measured and calm. "We'll need you both to come in for a briefing as soon as possible. In the meantime, we'll have a team of our best investigators on the case. Do you have any idea who might be behind this?" I hesitated for a moment, not sure if I was ready to reveal everything we knew. But Detective Santos spoke up before I could say anything. "There's a surveillance camera feed from one of the local businesses that might have captured the killer's face. We'll need to get a copy of that over to your team." She glanced at me, her eyes filled with determination. "We're not letting this person get away with this." As we hung up the phone, I felt a renewed sense of purpose coursing through my veins. The FBI would bring their expertise and resources to bear on the case, and we would find the person responsible for my sister's death. And when we did, there would be hell to pay. But even as I steeled myself for the battle ahead, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. That the killer was still out there, watching us, waiting for their next move. And that no matter how hard we tried, we might never be safe. As we drove to the FBI's headquarters, Detective Santos and I sat in silence, lost in our own thoughts. She reached over and squeezed my hand reassuringly, but I could tell she was just as afraid as I was. We both knew that we were venturing into uncharted territory, and that the stakes had never been higher. When we arrived at the FBI building, we were escorted into a large, windowless conference room. The room was filled with men and women in suits, some of them taking notes on laptops, others studying images projected onto the walls. As we took our seats at the table, I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe and apprehension. These were the best of the best, and they were here to help us. The lead agent, a stern-faced woman with short-cropped hair and steely gray eyes, introduced herself as Agent Johnson. She thanked us for coming in and then launched into a briefing on the case. They had already reviewed the surveillance footage from the local business, and while the image was grainy, they had managed to enhance it enough to make out some key details. "The suspect is a male, roughly 6 feet tall," Agent Johnson said, pointing to an enlarged image of the killer projected onto the wall. "He was wearing a hoodie, which obscured his face somewhat, but we were able to get a clear shot of his eyes. They're a striking shade of blue." The room went silent as everyone studied the image. "If you have any information about anyone who fits this description, please let us know immediately." My heart raced as I stared at the image of the killer. There was something about his eyes, something familiar. But I couldn't quite place it. I glanced over at Detective Santos, who was staring at the image intently as well. She looked like she was struggling with something. "Detective." Agent Johnson addressed Detective Santos, her voice softening. "You mentioned that you'd seen something familiar about the suspect's eyes. Do you want to share that with us?" Detective Rachel took a deep breath and nodded. "It's my father," she said, her voice barely audible. "He used to have the same eyes." There was a moment of shocked silence in the room. Agent Johnson exchanged glances with her colleagues, clearly unsure how to respond. Finally, she spoke again. "You think your father might be involved in this?" Detective Rachel's face twisted in pain. "I don't know," she said. "He's been estranged from the family for years. We haven't seen or heard from him since my brother was little. But I can't help but wonder if he somehow found out about her, about what happened." Her voice trailed off, and she looked like she was fighting back tears. I reached out and squeezed her hand, offering what little comfort I could. I knew how much it must hurt for her to even consider the possibility that her own father could be responsible for Emily's death. But I also knew that we couldn't afford to ignore any leads, no matter how painful they might be. Agent Johnson nodded solemnly. "We'll look into it," she said. "But for now, let's focus on finding this man. We've got our best people working on it, and we won't stop until we bring him to justice." The room fell silent again as everyone in the room turned their attention back to the grainy image of the killer, his striking blue eyes boring into us like two ice-cold daggers. I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. Whoever this man was, he was a cold-blooded killer, and he'd already taken far too much from us. It was time to make him pay. Detective Santos seemed to be lost in thought, her eyes locked on the image of her father's eyes. I couldn't begin to imagine what she must be going through, wondering if the man who raised her could be capable of such a heinous act. I only hoped that we could find some way to bring him to justice, one way or another. Agent Johnson cleared her throat, bringing our focus back to the task at hand. "All right, everyone. Let's start by going over the evidence we have so far. Nathan, why don't you walk us through the footage from the security cameras?" He nodded, taking a deep breath to steady my nerves. "Sure, Agent Johnson. As you all know, the security footage from the night of the murder was pretty grainy, but we were able to enhance it enough to make out some key details." The agent pointed to the enlarged image of the killer on the wall. "The suspect is a male, roughly 6 feet tall. He was wearing a hoodie, which obscured his face somewhat, but we were able to get a clear shot of his eyes. They're a striking shade of blue." The room went silent as everyone studied the image. The suspect was wearing a hoodie, as I mentioned, but we were able to make out a few other details. He had short, dark hair, and a stubble-covered jawline. His build was athletic, and he moved with confidence. He also seemed to have a limp when he walked, favoring his left leg. Agent Johnson nodded, writing down the details. "Anything else you'd like to share, people?" "There was something," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Something about the way he moved, it felt familiar. Like I've seen him before." Detective Santos looked at me sharply. "Where?" I shook my head, unable to put my finger on it. "I'm not sure. It's just a feeling I got. But I'm going to keep digging, see if I can't find out more about him." As the meeting continued, the team went over every detail of the evidence, searching for any clue that could lead us to the killer. Agent Johnson looked at me with a concerned expression. "Natalie, you mentioned that you have your own suspicions about the killer. Is there anything you want to share with us?" I hesitated, unsure if I should trust my gut instinct. But then I thought of Emily, and how she deserved justice. "There's something about the way he moves, something familiar. It's like I've seen him before, somewhere in my past." The room went silent as everyone processed my words. Agent Johnson leaned forward. "Can you be more specific? Do you have any idea where you might have seen him?" I shook my head. "Not exactly. It's just a feeling. But I think it might have something to do with my family." Detective Rachel, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "You mentioned that you were raised by your aunt and uncle. Do you know anything about your biological parents?" I hadn't given much thought to my parents since I was adopted as a child. "Not much," I admitted. "My aunt and uncle always said they didn't want to talk about them. They were just happy to take my sister and I in." Agent Johnson nodded. "That's understandable. But it might be worth looking into. We need to explore every lead, no matter how small." She glanced at her watch. "Why don't we set up a meeting with your aunt and uncle? See if they can shed some light on your past, and maybe help us find the person responsible for Emily's death." My heart raced at the thought of confronting my aunt and uncle about my past. I knew it would be difficult, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were hiding something important. "Okay," I said, steeling myself. "I'll talk to them tonight." Agent Johnson nodded. "Why don't you prepare some questions beforehand? That way, you can make sure you cover everything." I took out my notepad and jotted down a few questions. What did they know about my biological parents? Were they involved in anything shady? Had they ever received any threats? I felt a knot forming in my stomach as I wrote them down. The rest of the meeting was spent going over security footage and possible leads. Agent Johnson assigned a team to investigate my family's background, while Detective Santos focused on the killer's profile. As the hours ticked by, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease growing inside me. Finally, the sun began to set, and I made my way home. My aunt and uncle were sitting in the living room when I arrived. They looked up at me with worried expressions. "Natalie, we've been so worried about you. Is everything all right?" I took a deep breath and steeled myself. "There's something I need to talk to you about. Something important." They looked at each other, exchanging uncertain glances. "I need to know more about my past. About my biological parents. Agent Johnson thinks it might be connected to Emily's death." My aunt and uncle exchanged another glance before my aunt spoke up. We don't really know much. Your father was involved in some shady business deals, and your mother, she was never really the same after she left him." She hesitated, taking a deep breath. "But we never knew anything about anyone wanting to hurt Emily. We just wanted to give you a good life, away from all that." I nodded, digesting the information. "Did you ever get any threats? Anything suspicious?" My uncle shook his head. "No, nothing like that. But your father, he had enemies. Powerful ones. We were always worried that they might come after you." They looked at me, their faces filled with fear and uncertainty. "That's why we kept you away from him, from them." I felt a chill run down my spine. "So you think they might still be after me?" My aunt reached out and took my hand. "We don't know for sure, honey. But it's possible. You should be careful. Talk to Agent Johnson, let her help you." I nodded, still trying to process the information. "Do you have any idea who these enemies might be? Anything I should look out for?" My uncle cleared his throat. "Your father was involved with some, less than savory characters. People from the criminal underworld. We never knew their names, but we knew they were dangerous." The room fell silent for a moment as they exchanged another worried glance. Finally, my aunt spoke up. "We should tell you about the box. Your father kept it hidden, and when he disappeared, we found it here. In your room." I felt a knot forming in my stomach. What was in it? Letters, mostly. And pictures. It seemed like he was trying to protect someone. Maybe himself, maybe you. We never opened it, but we hid it away, just in case. My uncle took a deep breath. "We should probably give it to Agent Johnson. It might help her investigation." I nodded, unable to speak. The box, whatever it contained, was the only lead I had left. And now, my aunt and uncle were willing to give it to Agent Johnson. I felt a mixture of relief and fear wash over me. Maybe it was for the best, but a part of me wished I could unravel the mystery on my own. My aunt stood up, reaching for a key that hung on the wall. "It's still in the box we hid it in. We've kept it in the attic all these years. I'll go get it." She left the room, her footsteps muffled by the carpet. My uncle took my hand in his. "Natalie, we want what's best for you. We don't want you to get hurt. But please, be careful. These people your father knew, they're not to be messed with." I squeezed his hand, nodding. "I'll be careful. I promise." Moments later, my aunt returned with the box. It was smaller than I expected, about the size of a shoebox. The wood was worn, the hinges creaking as she opened it. Inside, there were stacks of letters, photographs, and even some newspaper clippings. The top letter was addressed to me. I hesitated for a moment before taking it out, unfolding it carefully. The letter was dated when I was 5 years old. The writing was shaky, almost illegible. It was from my father, and it was a confession. He admitted to his crimes, to the people he had wronged, and to the danger he had put us in. He begged for my forgiveness, promised to make things right if he could. But he didn't give any details, no names, no clues as to who might be after me now. I looked up at my uncle, confusion written on my face. "Do you have any idea what he meant by this?" My uncle took the letter from me, his brow furrowed. "No. Your father was always a mystery to us. We didn't want you to grow up like him. We only wanted to keep you safe." He sighed, handing the letter back. "I'm sorry we never told you more." The weight of their words settled heavily on my chest. I didn't know who to trust anymore. My father had been involved in something dark, something dangerous, and it had cost my sister her life. The box was filled with clues, but they were fragments, pieces of a puzzle that could never be completed. "Natalie?" Agent Johnson's voice broke into my thoughts. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." She glanced at my aunt and uncle, who exchanged another worried look. "Maybe it's better if we take it from here. We can go over everything at the station. You're too close to this." I nodded, unable to speak. As Agent Johnson packed up the box, I felt a sense of helplessness wash over me. My entire world had been turned upside down, and I was no closer to finding the truth than I had been before. As we left my aunt and uncle's house, I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever unravel the mystery that had become my life. In the car, Agent Johnson handed me a business card. "If you remember anything else, or if you need anything, don't hesitate to call me," she said, her voice softening. I took the card, nodding gratefully. Back at the station, we sat down in a small interrogation room. Agent Johnson spread the contents of the box out on the table, flipping through photographs and reading over my father's letters. She asked me questions about my childhood, about my father's friends, about anything that might help her understand what was going on. But each time I tried to answer, I felt as if I were grasping at shadows. As the hours wore on, Agent Johnson excused herself to make a phone call. I took the opportunity to study the box more closely. There were clues hidden among the photographs and letters, I could feel it. But they were fragmented, pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. When Agent Johnson returned, she looked thoughtful. "I've been talking to some people who might be able to help us," she said, her voice low. "They've agreed to take a look at this box and see if they can make any sense of it. But until then, we're going to need to keep you somewhere safe." She took me to a motel, paid for a room, and insisted that I stay there for the night. "It's not ideal," she admitted, "but it's the best we can do for now." I nodded, too exhausted and overwhelmed to argue. As I settled into the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was still out there, that it was only a matter of time before it found me again. Throughout the night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise outside my door sent a wave of adrenaline coursing through my veins. I kept thinking about my sister, about the fact that she was gone, and that I might be next. I reached under the bed, feeling for the gun that Agent Johnson had given me, since mine was at the precinct, reassuring myself that it was there. When the sun finally rose, I called my captain, telling him that I wasn't feeling well and wouldn't be in today. The lie tasted bitter in my mouth, but I didn't want to put anyone else in danger by going to work. As I hung up the phone, I knew that I had to find a way to unravel this mystery, to figure out who was behind it all. I couldn't just sit here, waiting for someone to come after me. I called Agent Johnson, hoping to get an update on their investigation. She sounded tired and frazzled, like she'd been up all night. "We're still digging," she said, "but we're making progress. I'll keep you posted." I thanked her and hung up, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. I wanted to help, but I was stuck in this motel room, waiting for someone to save me. As the day wore on, I tried to distract myself with television and takeout. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, that they were out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was only a matter of time before they found me again. And when they did, I knew that I wouldn't be able to run anymore. I decided to take a chance and call my best friend, hoping that she might be able to help. She answered on the second ring, her voice sounding groggy and sleepy. "Hey, it's me," I said, my voice quivering. "I need your help." She sat up straight, instantly alert. "What's going on? Is it your sister?" I took a deep breath and filled her in on everything that had happened since I'd last seen her. As I spoke, I could hear the alarm in my voice, the fear and desperation that threatened to overwhelm me. "I think they're coming after me next," I confessed. "I don't know what to do." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Okay," my friend finally said. "I'm coming over. Just stay put and lock the door until I get there." Her voice was firm, reassuring. I felt a tiny bit of relief, knowing that at least someone was on my side. She arrived at the motel an hour later, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She hugged me tightly, and I could feel the tremors in her body. "I'm so sorry, Nat," she whispered. "I'm here now, okay? We'll get through this together." Together, we sat on the bed, our backs against the headboard, and waited. Outside, the world continued to spin, oblivious to the danger that lurked in the shadows. Agent Johnson called to let me know that they'd made some progress, but they still didn't have enough to go on. I tried to keep my hopes up, but the truth was, I was running out of time. The longer they took, the closer my sister's killer would get. My friend and I sat in silence, our thoughts racing. Suddenly, she let out a gasp. "Look," she said, pointing to the floor. There, wedged between the baseboard and the carpet, where my bag had fallen when we had sat down on the bed, was a small envelope. It was addressed to me, in my sister's handwriting. My heart stopped for a moment, but I knew I had to open it. Carefully, I slid the envelope free and unfolded the note inside. It was a map, with cryptic symbols and arrows drawn all over it. "It's a map," I whispered. "It looks like a trail through the city." My friend looked at me with wide eyes. "What do you think it means?" I shrugged. "I don't know. But it's our only lead. We have to follow it." The decision made, we gathered our belongings and hurried out of the motel room. As we ran down the hallway and out the front door, I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following us. But the parking lot was empty, save for our rented car. We climbed into the car and sped off down the highway, following the map's directions as best we could. The trail led us through the city, from one abandoned warehouse to the next, each turn more perilous than the last. My heart raced with fear and determination as we raced through the darkness, chasing after a killer. Finally, after what seemed like hours, we reached the end of the trail. The map led us to an old, run-down house on the outskirts of town. The front door hung off its hinges, and the windows were boarded up. It was the perfect place for someone like my sister's killer to hide. Taking a deep breath, I steeled myself and slowly approached the dilapidated house. My friend followed close behind, her eyes darting nervously from side to side. I crept around to the back, searching for any signs of movement or sound. Everything seemed eerily silent, but I knew that didn't mean the killer wasn't nearby. As we circled around to the front, I spotted a small, concealed door set into the foundation of the house. It was slightly ajar, and a dim light flickered from within. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached out to push it open. We stepped inside, into a cramped and dusty hidden room. The walls were lined with shelves stacked high with all manner of strange objects, odd-looking trophies, twisted metal sculptures, and even what looked like human bones. In the center of the room was a rusty metal chair, its chains dangling ominously. The room was oppressively quiet, save for the faint whispering of the killer's voice coming from a nearby tape recorder. "He's here," I whispered to my friend. "We have to be careful." We crept forward, following the sound of the voice until we reached a corner of the room where we could see the killer hunched over a workbench. He was meticulously cleaning a knife, humming to himself as he worked. My heart raced as we watched him, trying to formulate a plan. I glanced at my friend and nodded silently. Together, we crept closer, moving stealthily until we were only a few feet away. I took a deep breath, mustering up all my courage, and then lunged forward, tackling the killer to the ground. There was a struggle, a flurry of movement, and then I felt a searing pain in my side as a knife slipped free from its sheath. With a gasp, I pushed the killer off me and scrambled away, clutching at the wound. My friend stood over me, her eyes wide with fear and shock. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I gritted my teeth against the pain and forced myself to my feet. "I'll live," I managed to say through gritted teeth. "We need to get out of here." We hurried toward the concealed door, but as we reached it, the killer lunged at us from the shadows. He grabbed my friend and threw her to the ground, pinning her down with one hand. With the other, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial of liquid. "No!" I screamed, launching myself at him again. We wrestled for control of the vial, our bodies thrashing on the dusty floor. Finally, with a sickening pop, the vial broke open, and the liquid spilled out over my friend's face and neck. She thrashed wildly, her eyes bulging from their sockets, and then went limp. I stared down in horror at her lifeless body, feeling a tear trickle down my cheek. The killer stood over us, a sadistic grin spreading across his face. "I'm afraid," he whispered, "that this is where your story ends." His voice was cold and emotionless, but there was a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. He stepped over my friend's lifeless body and walked casually toward the concealed door. I forced myself to my feet, my vision blurred by tears of rage and sorrow. "Wait!" I cried, grabbing a nearby object from the shelf. It was a rusty old shovel, its handle splintered and its blade nicked and dull. I brandished it like a weapon as the killer turned back to face me. "You can't get away with this," I shouted, my voice shaking with anger. "I'm going to make sure you pay for what you've done." The killer chuckled darkly and shook his head. "You don't understand," he said. "There is no escape from the darkness." His words sent a shiver down my spine, but they only served to fuel my anger. I swung the shovel wildly, aiming for his head. He ducked easily, laughing again as he stepped out of range. We circled each other warily, the tension in the air palpable. My breath came in ragged gasps, my muscles burning with exhaustion and adrenaline. The killer's movements were graceful and confident, almost dance-like. It was as if he was toying with me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Time seemed to slow down as we circled, the world around us fading into the background. All that mattered was this moment, this fight. The killer feinted, moving swiftly to the side, and then lunged forward, aiming a vicious strike at my chest. I managed to block it with the shovel, but the force of the blow sent me staggering back. I regained my balance and countered with a wild swing of my own, connecting with his shoulder. There was a satisfying crack, and he cried out in pain, stumbling back. He glared at me, his eyes narrowed with anger and pain. "You're not going to win," he hissed. "You never had a chance." His words cut deep, and for a moment I faltered. But then anger surged through me, stronger than ever. I raised the shovel high, determined to end this once and for all. As he charged forward, I swung with all my might, aiming for his head. The shovel connected with a sickening thud, and he staggered back, a look of shock and pain on his face. But he was quick to recover, his movements fluid and graceful. He dodged my next swing and countered with a strike of his own. I barely managed to block it, the force of the blow sending a wave of pain up my arm. We circled each other once more, both of us breathing heavily. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood, and the floor was slick with it. The killer's eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw something flicker behind them. Fear, perhaps. Or maybe it was just my imagination. I didn't have time to dwell on it, as he lunged forward again, his movements blurry and fast. I managed to deflect his strike, but only just. We were both growing more desperate now, our breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, in a blur of motion, he disarmed me. The shovel clattered to the floor, and he stepped forward, raising his knife. "The darkness always wins," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. "There's no escaping it." I closed my eyes, bracing for the final blow. But instead, there was a loud crash, and the killer staggered back. I opened my eyes to see a figure standing in the doorway, a fire axe in hand. It was one of the cops from the FBI meeting, and he was moving quickly to subdue the killer. "Get back," he shouted at me. "Stay down." I did as I was told, watching in horror as the cop and the killer struggled. They were both moving so fast, their bodies a blur of motion. The killer managed to disarm the cop, but the officer didn't seem to be fazed. He grappled with the killer, forcing him to the ground. The killer thrashed wildly, trying to break free, but the cop was too strong. Finally, with a grunt of effort, he cuffed the killer and hauled him to his feet. "You have the right to remain silent," he said, reciting the Miranda warning. "Anything you say or do can and will be used against you in a court of law." The killer snarled, struggling against the cuffs. "You think you've won? You haven't even begun to understand." The cop glanced at me, his expression grim. "Are you okay, kid?" I nodded, trying to catch my breath. "Yeah, I think so." He turned his attention back to the killer. "Come on, let's get you out of here." They led the killer away, his head held high despite the cuffs, his eyes never leaving mine. I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, but also unease. The horror of the night still hung over me like a thick cloud. As the cops escorted the killer out, I struggled to my feet, my limbs weak and shaky. "You did good, kid," one of the cops said, patting me on the shoulder. "You stayed calm and did what you had to do." I didn't respond, still too overwhelmed to say anything. They led me out of the room, through the now crowded station, and outside into the cold night air. The media was already swarming, their flashing lights and screaming questions making the world seem even more surreal. The police took my statement, and then they led me to a waiting car. As I was driven away to the station, I glanced back one last time, hoping to see the killer's face in the crowd. But he was gone, and I couldn't help but wonder if I'd ever see him again. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories, give us a like if you want to see more, and drop a comment below to let us know your thoughts.